Hello and most welcome to 1714 of the Heidegger series. We will today continue with the go-through of Rethinking the Inner by Johnston. So, let me just make a little recap what's going on before. I give myself a mug of tea. We've been looking at the, can you call it the myth of the inner, almost like a persistent fixation. Where everything has to originate or develop from. The first point of origin. That would lead to a whole chain of domino tails that follow upon each other and construct a first cause and a aita, a telos that will take us further and further to the end or promised end. Now this so to speak, chains everything. Every part of the chain interlocking. Given a sort of fixed and ready-made, almost obstructing view of the world. Leads to a standstill, and that combined with explanations, asking the question and persistently not managing to put those questions in the right spot. A sort of misuse of the language. the actions are no longer being informed. So they will not enter to it. I think entering is a rather apt term. It's about going into the concepts, inhabiting them, instead of looking at them at a distance with the instrument of explanation, meaning, origin, and telos. As to avoid the same sort of fixation we see in the universe. With a big bang, inexorably permanent laws, fixed, chained together, dragging the whole thing to its aita, telos. To be applied to these happenings, explanation. It's a picture of a sort of lockdown. Also the delineation of inside and outside covers a whole range of finer, minute aspects, differences, properties. As well as does this rock hard inside with a supposed inner speech instead of thinking. That makes it inaccessible. Wittgenstein explains that the perceived hiddenness of one's inner is an effect of grammar, of use. once we're starting to see that all the different feelings, perceptions, dispositions, attitudes work differently. Some with a slight ingredient of sameness, or at least there are parallels, but it opens up to look into an incredible richness. It slowly opens up that knowing, believing, understanding are quite different things. Do things differently, have different duration, are connected to the other tendencies in a different way. And we start realizing too that this this is the life world, where all these things developed together, and thereby are together. Having an attitude towards, it's not something contingent in the language game. Doesn't have different truth values. It's part of the grammar of being. First person. You do the attitude. False or true simply doesn't stick. It doesn't fit. In an article by Edmund Dane, an attitude towards a soul, Wittgenstein, other minds, and the mind. There are some pretty massive sites. This one, don't ask what goes on in us, when we are certain that but how is the certainty that this is so manifested in people's action? And that is attitude. It's an absolute certainty in the action. The action does not have fallibility or any level of doubt to it. I'll read something from the abstract. We tend to take it for granted that we know what is involved in the belief of other minds, and that the real problem lies in trying to justify that belief. By contrast, I argue that we misunderstand what belief in other minds really involves. And that the problem of other minds itself has its source in that misunderstanding. My aim then is to rethink what is involved in a belief in other minds, and I do so in terms of what Wittgenstein calls an attitude towards a soul. I argue that this not only shows what is wrong with the problem, of other minds, but also has significant consequences for our understanding of what the mind itself is too. One such consequence is that ethical considerations have a much more fundamental role to play in thinking about the mind that is typically thought to be the case. You prepare for that attitude. It becomes the truth. So it's an attitude and a decision and an act. Words are participatory. They are not tokens or domino tiles that wait for something to happen outside, as remaining completely apathetic until the moment they can get a truth value. Instead, the decision, the act, the attitude and the want is in many cases, or even the majority of the cases, what's happening. So that the contingent belief-like or opinion-like, rather as opinion-like, is quite rare. Wittgenstein is clarifying this by the famous automaton. So that something that is alive has a surface where the word concepts alive stick to. Whereas, for instance, in a piece of stone, it's too smooth for there to be any grip that can make life stick. That is a feature, almost like the stone and whatever that happened to be alive are together already. Therefore they interact in specific ways. And what we do, what happens once you go into Wittgenstein, is to discover that this is the case. There will be no explanation as to why this is the case, because explanations were the problem, is part of the problem why we confuse these things. It's a moral act to have an attitude that people have souls. A moral act that get moral consequences. And of course, attitude can be different things. Of course, also directed towards intention. Willingness. Knowledge comes in here too, and it's a telling example from Paul Johnston's book, page 184. Begins with seeing aspect and why we hesitate to use the word know in relation to the inner. The problem is not that the inner is hidden, but that the language game it involves is very different from those where we normally talk about knowledge. For example, if knowing someone is glad to see us involves being secure in our relation to her, that is, being certain rather than uncertain in our own pleasure. This itself differentiates it from other kinds of knowledge. Another difference is that when we are certain, the basis of that certainty is often unclear. Since the individual cannot prove her assertion, the claim, "I know he was pleased to see me," is equivalent for other people to the statement, "I had a definite impression he was pleased to see me." Moreover, the statement's implications have none of the clarity we associate with knowledge. If it was submitted to a court of law, the case would not be the same as that of a physicist who stated that he had done an experimentation and this was the result. If I had known the other person for a long time, the court would probably also allow my statement to stand, give it weight. But my absolute certainty would not signify knowledge. For knowledge, the court would have to be able to draw quite definite conclusions. So the uncertainty in the language game when it comes to knowledge in these circumstances is quite different from what it would be in science or at the court of law. It's a big difference. Let's continue. If we now return to the question of the uncertainty in our language game, this can be seen as having various components. On the one hand, it may reflect uncertainty about how the individual is likely to act. On the other hand, it may involve an inability to find our feet with the individual. Here it is not a question of whether she is pretending. Rather, the uncertainty goes deeper. The difficulty lies not just in prediction, but also in our relation to the other person. To illustrate this point, Wittgenstein suggests that we look at our uncertainty about other people's pain in the light of the question as to whether an insect feels pain. There is a quote here from Remarks on the Philosophy of Psychology. One kind of uncertainty is that with which we might face an unfamiliar mechanism. In another, we should possibly be recalling an occasion in our life it might be that someone who's just escaped the fear of death would shrink from swatting a fly, though he would otherwise do it without thinking twice of it. Or on the other hand, that having this experience in his mind's eye, he does with hesitancy what otherwise he does unhesitantly. So the takeout of that is our uncertainty is not empirical. It's not coming from this having an opinion that, or you make a sort of investigation into yourself, introspection, and try to find out, how much do I trust this person? Do I believe him? No. It's also a decision. I think, in parenthesis, this understanding in the beginning can feel like you decide you decide also the very value of the trustworthiness, if he is trustworthy or is to be believed. But that is not entirely true. our uncertainty may, as it were, be objective or subjective. It may stem from uncertainties about the entity being judged, or from an uncertainty about our relation to that entity. As this suggests judgments about what others are feeling, etc., have two aspects. They bring together a predicative and a non-predicative element. For even when I do not rest secure in my sympathy, I need not think of uncertainty about his later behavior. The question is not just how the others will behave, but how that behavior should be understood. We may be unsure what judgments to make about someone's inner state, not just because we are uncertain how she will act, but also of an uncertainty in our relationship to her. An uncertainty about whether to call what she is experiencing sadness or self-pity. And as you can see, it's very much down to absolutely everyday acts in his example, down to the ground, to say the least. But once more, it's connected to the first person versus the third person perspective. The one looking into if the person is really sad has a different position because of a shared past. It is not like the person have a sort of a memory bank in her head that can be checked to see what sort of evidence do I have to trust her. No, it's grammatical of the use as well. It's the sharedness of coming from the same point. Developing at the same time. But not about engravings in the head or an hidden inner that could potentially be investigated to find proof of how deep one needs to go to find out whether the person is being sad or is having self-pity actions. So usually it's grammar that comes to the fore when it's about Wittgenstein. And I say grammar, give it some time. The grammar is not universal over the whole language, but sometimes there are traits that are more universal or more, at least a little bit more covering. Like, I would say, the very helpful thing of thinking in the terms of first person approach and third person approach. That is me and he, she. That is very helpful. It's a good start to get a first solid footing on grammar as doing. And that will be, the more you practice it and do it, be stronger and stronger. Put a pause there, say thank you very much. So we continue this. I think in this context it's worth mentioning also what sort of person Wittgenstein was. He's really a sort of different philosopher, not really interested in philosophy from the beginning, much more into the world, having no connection to abstract subjects originally. Being high-strung and of high intelligence, that made a clear impression on the intellectuals and developers of the time. He came from one of the richest families in the world. And he spent his inheritance wisely in doing good deeds. I think this is very important. Might sound that, what does that have to do with it? I'd say quite a lot. I'm beginning to get a feeling for the high morality of Wittgenstein and his philosophy. Some morality that I experienced myself while studying philosophy because of the misunderstanding completely disappears. And it gets truth values. And all of a sudden we no longer understand ourselves. I remember my professor really went far when he was saying things like it could be okay to murder for the sake of happiness for the mass or something like that. But I could clearly see in his face that this was in a contradiction to what he felt or what was working in the language game. It was not a good fit. That gives me one a bit more confidence and stamina in going in the direction of wanting to understand him. Of course, with the help of Johnston and Schulte, Dane. But some things are almost blocked from understanding, and I'm really happy that this massive, if not enormous, study we put away for this is very helpful. Names like James Gibson open up to the understanding that the inner doesn't really compute or work well when it comes to theories of perception and how to construct a new theory of cognition. His neologism affordances is in a way quantum physical, not situated in either of the two poles of the subject nor the object. Bayesian mathematics, I'd say, very important as well. And we've been looking into mathematics many times before, and intuitionist and constructive mathematics are close to the thinking, or at least in the proximity to the Wittgensteinian thinking. And he did know about at least intuitionism from Brouwer. This we know. Mathematics is one of those locking mechanisms, so that twists everything even more in the direction of not understanding. So this is like a fabric softener, making it easier for Wittgenstein to enter. And of course, Jacques Derrida has been of an enormous importance. Especially the last text we read, Life, Death, where we saw that Bernard Kengelhem Monod, François Jacob and others were using clearly metaphysical concepts in their reasoning, and then all of a sudden ejecting them all, or not acknowledging them in the central theme. This is the logic of the supplement, and how odd things can be hidden in the midst of the text, ignored to convince the author and the readers to a sort of one-eyedness. And this is also helpful with Wittgenstein, because this one-sidedness is, of course, the hidden inner. The closed-off inner, the hidden core of the inaccessibility itself, or why not the Platonic cave. It hides itself in plain open, I'd say. And there it resides, and there it can be secure, oddly enough. I was literally shocked by the incredible metaphysical claims laid down by François Jacob especially, to prove that everything is deterministic, material, and deterministic, rational, if you like. And it's also interesting to note that evolutionists like Canguilhem, Bernard, and Jacob and Monod have a whole legion of opponents, try to attack them and their deterministic views. Today, one of the proponents, the successors of Monod and Bernard, Richard Dawkins is maybe the biggest target for such attacks. No one has ever gone into his text to see how much metaphysical, transcendent, essentialist thinking that supports his non-essential thinking to make it convincible. Otherwise, it would fall flat. A deterministic reasoning would never convince anyone, at least himself. The bigger aitas and telos are the only one that can convince. And therefore, the texts become highly skewed, erratic. Partial, maybe it's better. Better word in this case. As we often have mentioned, monosemic. As we see, more and more is in itself an impossibility. It wouldn't mean anything to say that something is monosemic. Like the same as saying that a duck rabbit only has the duck. Be senseless. A failed statement. Page 14 in Dane's article. An attitude towards the soul. An attitude towards a soul. Our attitudes towards something, such as our attitude towards what is alive or to what is dead, or towards a human being or a soul, are in this sense a matter of the ways in which we can act in relation to it, and the kinds of things we can say about it. They are a matter of the kind of behavior and the kind of talk that gets a foothold in connection with it. Or to which it is accessible or inaccessible, or of the kinds of behavior that make sense in connection with it, and the kind of things it makes sense to say about it. It's about this foothold. Very important. This is an absolutely new way or a new phrase. It doesn't stick. Wittgenstein also used the phrase unzugänglich, inaccessible. I said above that our attitudes in this sense are not or not simply a matter of what we do or how we in fact act on any given occasion. But listen now, and this is extremely helpful, but how we do actually act on some specific occasion, or how we typically act such as are typically responding to another's pain with pity rather than with indifference. For instance, how we typically react doesn't really compute in the ordinary thinking, but it's of incredible importance. How we typically act on an individual level, but also all of us. It has enormous significance. The movement, if you like, therein lies everything, or at least an enormous amount. This is where it all lies. And I continue. Nevertheless, forms a part of our attitudes. In this sense, the two are not entirely independent of one another. Let me expand that. Having an attitude towards something, that very attitude changes the towarded thing, just as in quantum physics. I'd say that is something that doesn't compute in regular philosophy, and sadly most completely ignored for not being known as a factor. But how we normally act, that is where all the knowledge is, all the understanding are those very movements. We have now left the idea of intelligence, understanding being engravings in the deep hidden of the head. They're all out there, and what we have out there is no longer fixed objects, but things that are vivid, movable. Alive almost. And this is why Kangelham, Jacob, Dawkins and all others need to use the live expressions to convince about determinism and stillness. The same movement is the only thing that can move anyone. And it's all contained in the movement. Remember the gesture that awoke Wittgenstein, the Napolitanian gesture. It is a movement, and it can be made in 1,000 different ways. Some of these are more elegant, complex and informative. Some are less. And now we're talking just about one singular, extremely simple movement. Compare that to Bernstein conducting Elgar's music. It is refined, it's complex, it's elegant. The movements are specific, trained over decades. They carry it. And they also carry, if you like, the soul. What it is to be an alive person. And I have to constantly repeat how important Rudolf Pfeiffer, with one F, the Swiss professor, his mechanic droids, where the understanding is in the movement itself. There are no innerness in these things. And how they develop and learn without seeing, hearing, sensing, smelling. And already the complexity level is beyond belief. Only the movement can store all those things, and an incredible potentially, exponentially much more than the idea of engravings, which is so limiting. Memory scrabbles. And point of origin, Big Bang, start, source, going through cause and effect to its determined telos aita, seems more and more limited. The richness of these acts are just beyond belief. They show that there are much more to humanity than that closed off one-sidedness of Cangelhem and Bernard. And you can also, that struck me when I'm reading this, how uncertain we become as human beings if attitude towards is being replaced in belief in, as in Cangelhem, Bernard and Jacob Monod, Dawkins. It weakens everything. Nothing is no longer certain. That weakness is built into the very structure of the texts of the thinking. And we human beings get forever lost in regurgitating thinking of, are we doing the correct thing or not? Torturous thoughts, and with a start as opinion that will never come to a conclusion. will never come to its end, will be infused with uncertainty. And if we start using opinion for souls, which is so important, being a human, we will be at absolute loss. Maybe that's where we are today. I am not sure if that is in line with Wittgenstein's thinking, but we could speculate anyway. Maybe that's where we are presently, to a certain extent anyway. But of course we can never leave the language game. We cannot be made dysfunctional. And I continue to read further down, and how there is an interdependence between what sort of attitude we have to something and what that thing or human is. It is not separable from what I think of it, my attitude, my morality. Could be a fitting word there. So it is not, for instance, that in wait, sorry, I read wrong. The two are not entirely independent of one another, and the way in which it does so is closely comparable to the way in which agreement in the judgments that we make, agreement with respect to what is true and what is false, is itself part of what makes the particular language game or form of life in which those judgments feature the particular language game or form of life that it is. Let's take a Sprachspiel like football. It would be wrong to say that football are all the rules, the two parts of the game, the Big Bang and the Aita in between, the odd 90 minutes, the grass, the goals, the players. No. Almost all is the interaction in between the players. And their movements toward each other. And what will decide the success of the game is what attitudes they have towards one another. If they treat each other soulfully in a sportsmanlike way, everyone will gain. But if they do not see the other ones as having souls, it will be a different game. And as we often focus in on, the words that accompany them will also be different. But I think you now see that those words do not contain the game. The comments that the player do. And we know that even skilled football players who are sitting in the commentator bench reporting to the media will not accurately judge the game. Can only be done with the ones inside the game. And if there are years of not practice, the distance will be larger and larger to understanding what actually happens in the game. And sport commentators who never played football were the worst. You can compare the unskilled football commentators with analytical philosophers. If the interaction is not there, the words as expressed by Schulte, I think was they will not hit the target. There is no corollary for the words, and we need that because language is strictly, as we mentioned before, it is strictly not private. It's not my possession inside, in the inside, which I most usually cannot even reach myself. Wittgenstein is inviting us to look at things more closely, enter them, going into them loud and clear. enter into the game of language. Do the acts. In the beginning you will fail more often, and once you get into it, you get more and more skilled. You will also understand yourself better. You get the necessary corollary for your words to a greater and greater degree. More information, if you like, or understanding, wisdom can enter. What previously was hidden is opening up, and that is in itself adventurous and incredibly interesting. You also will feel a relaxation when entering in the game. Being with others will not put such a strain. The ball is going to be in the air much more if my rather plump metaphor is excused. And everything in your life will become more vivid. Even such things as colors and tastes and smells. They come from the action. And there is nothing passive with sensing. Something that we brought up in the chapter about sensations. That our mistaken understanding that they are very far from this passive, non-movable camera oscura. Perception is participatory, dependent on in which attitude or you enter into it. The morality, it's once more, it's so close to the football game. A demoralized player will have a quite different effect on the game. And to a lesser degree, from the beginning, he will not see the other players as soulful. You can imagine the game would be rougher, more black and white. Not an interesting cooperative play. So the word Sprachspiel is really fitting, but it also has to go all the way to play. I can imagine dance is included here as well. I continue with page 14 here in this article. I recommend you follow by. So it is not, for instance, that in failing to respond to another's pain with pity, in denying them our pity, we therefore do not have as our attitude toward them an attitude toward a soul or toward a human being, and so fail in this sense to recognize their humanity. Fail to recognize them as another human being like ourselves. That attitude is equally present in our denying them, our pity when they are in pain, through our recognition that they are a kind of thing. From which pity can be withheld, as well as to which it can be given. How we do, in fact, behave is part of our attitude, not in the sense that if we do not behave in a certain ways on a specific occasion, then we no longer have the relevant attitude. How we act or behave is part of our attitude, in the sense, if we did not typically or did not ever respond to another's pain. With pity, or in the ways that are characteristic of pity, our attitude, our form of life. Would in fact, to that extent, be a different one. That's also, if we react differently, it would be a different life world. Completely different in every sense. And once more, it's well worth repeating. If a lion could speak, we would not understand it. And as I mentioned sometimes before, the American indigenous wise man I met said when he travels only 250 miles, the inhabitants of that area has a different world. The nature is different, and he cannot be understood, neither understand. It's the limit of the Sprachwelt, Lebenswelt. It stops there. They do not always have to be extremely sharp. But remember the football game. The commentators who recently played, maybe a couple of weeks before, will understand more of anything, but particularly the game. And if you haven't been playing for years, it's considerably less. But it's down to very little if you haven't been playing at all. And another important feature for the radio listener, it will sound almost the same. You would need to be an expert yourself to tell one commentator, good commentator from a less skilled one. It would be hard even for the expert if his phrases actually were workable, if they accompanied a proper game or a game that he understood, or the words was just formed like ChatGTP, could still satisfy the radio listener. That's another important feature to 100%. Maybe it's not even important if there is a huge insight there for the unskilled. Well, pretty interesting, I say myself. I hope you had something out of this. I'm sorry about the rather monotonous regurgitating of Rethinking the Inner. But the reason is, I think it's well worth it. One of the best reads in ages, I'd say. but it also develops what happened before, what we've gone through these years, decades. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, evening, whatever you have. Bye bye for now.